right. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shoot Your Shot Photography Show. My name is Ben Jacobson, and I will be your host today. I hope you are all enjoying your Friday. If you're catching this live and if you're watching the replay, I hope your day's been going great so far. Shoot Your Shot Photography Show is where I get to sit down with talented artists from around the world to discuss photography, life, and a lot of the other nuances that often seem to fall somewhere in between. If this is your first time catching the show, welcome. I appreciate you spending the time with us today. My goal with this series is to share the work and stories of photographers that I admire and find interesting, with the hopes of motivating and inspiring others to get out there and shoot your shot. I wanted to start today's episode off a little bit differently than my normal introduction, but just taking a moment and taking a breath to appreciate that we're here. I think that the past year has been especially trying for many of us, and life happens so fast that I'd like to just stop for a second or two and be grateful that we're here. This may sound a little hippy dippy, but sometimes I like that. I think you guys are awesome for being here, and I really feel fortunate that you're joining us. And I also feel really honored to be doing something that I love so much, which is talking with other interesting folks about their passion. Which leads me perfectly to our guest today, the illustrious Colby Brown. Colby is a landscape and wildlife photographer whose career spans the globe. His photography has taken him to over 80 countries and counting, with new workshops around the world lined up. I imagine that number is soon to be growing as well. So without any further ado, please welcome our guest, Colby Brown.
Hey, Ben, how's it going?
Welcome. I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
I'm excited to be here. I like the show. I like the concept of what you're doing here, and I'm happy to play a small role and be here for this conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that so much. Your stream is looking fantastic today. It looks like you've been putting in some work over the lockdown to gussy it up a little bit for you.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked about this, before we jumped on, but I think one of the silver linings for a lot of us creatives that have felt kind of bottled up without being able to travel, especially myself as a travel photographer. I usually travel 6 or 7 months out of the year. And so I all of a sudden last year outside of March, I found myself with a lot of time and the desire and need to get creative. And this is something that I've been wanting to do, to kind of completely redesign my home studio here. And so we put in wood floors. We've done audio dampening panels everywhere. We've done custom lighting. We've done all sorts of fun stuff. So this is the beautiful silver lining out of the chaos that was 2020.
Well, it looks fantastic. We got like a nice red versus blue going on here.
I like it's good. It's color compatibility right there. I like it.
I like it. Awesome. So let's just kind of start. I wanted to allow you to kind of introduce yourself for those who may not be familiar with your work. Who's Colby Brown, and kind of how did you get to be where you are now?
Sure. So for those that don't know me, I'm a landscape, travel, and wildlife photographer, which is a bit of a mouthful, but I've been doing this for almost 15, 16 years now. I've been fortunate to work with companies like National Geographic and a lot of other big names in the industry. Right now, I'm a Sony artisan. I used to work with Canon and Phase One before that. And I realized early on in my career that I had a desire and a passion to kind of dive into a lot of different genres of photography. I like the challenge. I like the change. I like the contrast. There's a reason that a 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 job never really worked out for me, is because I need constant change. I can't be doing the same thing all the time. So if I just shot landscapes, or if I just shot wildlife, or just did photojournalism or philanthropic work, I think I would get bored after a while. And so this kind of keeps my passion moving. And it's something I'm very proud of. A lot of people in my space in the industry tend to have been forced to specialize, which is great. I understand the concept. But for me, like I said, that desire to, every time I leave the house outside of 2020, it's for a different job. It's for a different project. I mean, even with 2020, I started the year off, trekking with wild silverback gorillas in Uganda for New Year's Eve. And then from there, I went to Norway to photograph the Northern Lights and teach a workshop up there. And then from there, I was doing, portrait work and street photography in Cuba. And then the world locked down. But that's like a really good indication of just kind of my typical, couple week schedule, where I like to kind of bounce around and try different things. So it's kind of a long-winded answer. I didn't really get into how I got into photography, but at least talks about my desire to diversify my interest and learn from each of those different genres as well, which I think is a key element that at least has helped me not only be a better creative, but also, learn in the process and learn from my mistakes from each of the different types of genres or interests that I've had over the years, and let them kind of compound and those learning lessons to apply to different genres that I didn't think was, possible or necessary back then.
Sure. Yeah, bouncing around a little bit from week to week is, I would say, a little bit of an understatement for how you kind of set that up there. But I think that it brings up like an interesting perspective of just the idea that you can take multiple different styles and different genres, and you can kind of blend those together and come out with something that is, maybe somewhere in the same realm of like what you're producing. And I think that when I see like some of the shots that you had of Cuba and stuff, like I can see the same kind of through line of how you compose your shots based on like just like the cleanliness of the shot itself. Like everything has intention behind it, and it feels like it's very intentional in that way. I am really curious how it kind of began, because I think that is something that a lot of us kind of originally start out with when we are getting involved in photography. Is you kind of just start sampling, out of the bulk bins, whatever little bits and pieces that you get a chance to do. I think often we go on like a family vacation or something, and we bring our camera along, and they're like, okay, that's our first dose into travel or destination work or something along those lines. And you get a new puppy, and you're like, oh, okay, well, this is kind of my chance to photograph animals. And how did it kind of evolve into where you're able to not only continue to carry that same ability to diversify, but also how did you maintain that to where you're now able to consistently have campaigns from larger clients that are allowing you to have so much flexibility? I think coming from my background of wedding photography, it's like if you don't niche down, like you're not going to make it. And so
Sure.
like hearing like your perspective of, getting a little flavor of life from each different area is just like so foreign to me. How did you manage to make this work?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. Well, let's backtrack. Let's go to the initial, the first part of the question, then the second part we'll kind of wrap up with that. So the first part is like how I got into this. It's a similar story, kind of what you outlined as an example. I'd always been a little bit interested in photography here and here, but not all that much, to be honest, until I took a family trip with my family to Hawaii and was able to experiment and play around with my mother's Canon Rebel at the time. It was right around the time when like the first Rebels came out that were affordable. And I kind of at least piqued my interest, where I was like, hey, let me, give me the camera. Let me try to see what I can do. And it wasn't too long after that I kind of, I realized that I was getting addicted to this idea of travel and wanting to see more of the world. And so by the time that I graduated from college, I tried the 8-to-5 job. I worked in the hospital as a safety administrator. I'm actually writing, mitigation plans for pandemics and stuff, coincidentally. And I just realized it wasn't for me. And I ended up moving up. I was living in Dallas, Texas at the time. I ended up moving up to British Columbia, Canada, where I'm a dual citizen, dual Canadian and American. And moved up there and just, came to the realization that I wanted to be back on the road, and I wanted to travel, and I wanted to find myself into places that I felt out of my element, because I like that challenge. I like the contrast to my ideas and beliefs. And it was there during that kind of hiatus that therapy sessions of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life out of college, that I realized that I wanted to travel, and hey, maybe photography could be a cool way to make a few bucks on the side. And so I really just fell into photography. It was like, hey, I should buy a camera. I'm going to be traveling around, or I want to travel around. Maybe these two should go together. And that kind of just snowballed everything from there. 3 years from that point, when I bought my first camera, I actually ended up getting hired by National Geographic to help them develop some of their student expedition programs in Central and South America. I spent a year living down in the Galapagos, in Ecuador, developing a lot of those programs, and that kind of gave me a bit more flavor for education. And each of those different kind of milestones that have happened throughout my career, such as working for Nat Geo, opened up a lot more doors and allowed me to begin to, mold my own revenue streams and business ideas. And I always wanted to wrap my interest into that. Like, I think it's a common misnomer for a lot of entrepreneurs or a lot of people that want to get into entrepreneurship, that you think that you go from a 8-to-5 job to working for yourself, and that you make all this money and you don't have to work all that much and you pick your hours. And like, that's not how it works. You go from having one boss you dislike to having, one boss that you still dislike, but it happens to be yourself. Because you have to be on yourself to make sure that you're doing these things right. And then, going to client work, like, you then all of a sudden realize that instead of having one boss, you might have 50 in a given year, or for wedding photography for you, you in the past, you might have had a ton of different clients that you have to then please. And so I've always wanted to control a bit more of my destiny. So I try to make sure that every single job that I had led to another. I try to make sure that every single image that I captured and ultimately, processed in, Photoshop or Lightroom or Capture One or whatever, ended up having, 5 or 10 different, potential values, streams of revenue, whether it was licensing or selling the image or marketing it or using it to fill workshops or putting it in ebooks. And so each of the different projects that I worked on, each of the different clients that I worked for, I always tried to make sure that they led to more and more work. And that has allowed me to have quite a bit of success over the years, which then gave me the freedom to craft my revenue streams exactly how I wanted them, rather than be tied into a niche, which, as you said, there's a reason that a lot of people do it, because I don't want to say it's easier, but it's definitely a path of least resistance, because you perfect something, you get good at something, you get known for something, and people come to you, right? It makes perfect sense. There's also freedom in breaking from those constraints, if you want to call it that. I personally do, and not everyone does. And trying to navigate those waters on your own, and assuming that you have a decent business sense and that you can be personable and you're not a jerk, which is an interesting tenet even in the photo industry or business industry, where, it's kind of like rule number 1, don't be an ass. It's, as long as you have that, then you have the potential to make revenue streams out of almost anything that you do. And so that's kind of what I've done. I piecemealed it in the beginning. I kind of built on the foundation of successful projects and successful jobs. I made sure that every one of those career wins led to another. And then, like I said, maximize every single piece of content that I've ever created, so that I can hopefully use it in as many places as possible and get the most value out of it. And then that will lead to another opportunity, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And it sounds to me like it's again, just relating back to the intentionality behind what you're doing. I think it sounds to me like just the ability to have that foresight has really helped you be intentional with what you're doing. Because you kind of glossed over like the idea that like you started and then 3 years later you're leading workshops for Nat Geo. And I think to most people that's like an insurmountable task in order to complete. And I think that, of course, for almost anyone it would be. But I think that just understanding like your intention behind it, that definitely helps kind of understand how that path was laid. Was there?
Well, sure. I mean, really quickly, just interjecting in there, like, there's absolute truth in what you're saying, and the intention and whatnot definitely came. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily there all the time, because early on I was like everyone else, starting out, not really sure what I was doing, trying to figure it out as I was going. I always tried to make sure that I was moving forward, even if I didn't know where that direction was going early on. And when it came to the Nat Geo thing, it actually isn't as crazy as it sounds. I had been traveling around for a few years at the time. I had a decent portfolio. I came home after living in the Himalayas for a few months, working on some projects with the Sherpa communities. And waiting in the mail when I got home was a pamphlet for Nat Geo's student expedition program that they were launching. And I looked at the leaders, I looked at what they were doing, and I was like, you know what? I could do this. And so I had the confidence, I had, I had the portfolio, I had the desire to want more and to sit there and look at that opportunity and said, why not me? If it's not going to be me, it's going to be someone else, right? And so I then, figured out who I needed to talk to and reached out and sent in a resume and then had a video interview and had another interview. And then I initially got hired to work in Belize. And then they called me back and said, hey, we have an opportunity in the Galapagos. And before they finished the sentence, I was like, I'm in. And so I think there's an over romanticized notion of life of a travel photographer from social media and all sorts of other stuff. But at the same time, there's almost like a reverse stigma that thinks that the successes such as finding an opportunity to work for Nat Geo is unattainable for people as they're just starting out. I don't think that's the case. I think that having the drive, having the confidence and the humbleness to admit that you obviously you're not perfect and you have things to work on, mixed in with talent can provide immense opportunities for anyone, including today. I mean, a lot of people think that the photo industry is kind of shut down with, COVID and what's happened over the last years. I don't think that's the case. I think there's actually more money to be made now than ever before, but it's going to be in different revenue streams that you might have been used to. And right now we're at the precipice where all those old revenue streams are old, a year old before COVID, are starting to open back up. So there's even more opportunity. So I think a lot of it's your mindset. When a lot of people get into photography or thinking about doing photography, whether it's, on the side or for a living, that they think that the business side of things are something that they will never be good at. And so they put this negative connotation on it instead of looking at it as an opportunity or a way, including to be creative, which is what I think of business as. I love making pitches. I love putting together proposals. I love talking to companies and pitching ideas. And I think that if you go into it with that mindset of the opposite, where you're like, I hate this. Oh, I'm not very good at this. You never put in the energy. You never put in the effort to learn how to make a proper pitch or how to do a cold email or, to formulate a plan or a project that you want to work on. And then, you just kind of get, despair of being rejected with not ever actually pushing yourself out there. And I think that's where a lot of people are. They kind of expect success to come to them rather than to have the will or the stubbornness or whatever you want to call it to put themselves out there and kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there's a huge amount of ability to kind of have that tenacity to take a leap and jump out and just really see what happens. Because to your point, I mean, having that confidence to know that you have a portfolio put together that you feel is comparable or at least on par with some of the other educators that are in that space, I think that's a huge step. But it's also, I think, something that is attainable despite how many years you've been doing photography. There's not necessarily a gate that's preventing you from making the ask.
Absolutely.
I think especially if you're getting to that point to where you are, you're seeing something in the mail and you're like, I could do that. Or I feel that I'm confident enough or capable enough that I could be there.
Sure.
Yeah, having that is huge. And
I think it helps
building
for sure.
up to that is probably where a lot of people are having a hard time getting to. They're kind of suffering from the artist's own dilemma of, not liking their own work and
Sure.
Being their own worst critic.
Well, I think that's, it's a really interesting segue into the topical conversation of skill and competition. Like, I will let everyone watching right now on a little secret. There will always be someone that is a better photographer than you, and there will always be someone that's a worse photographer than you. Like, it shouldn't be an excuse to not try to do something because you feel you aren't good enough or aren't worthy enough. I think too much of that is more of a societal issue that we have, not to get too, exocentric, but this idea that we have this external validation that you need in order to feel confident in what you're doing. I think that we as a society, even we as an industry, have this idea that failure is this negative thing, is this horrible thing that no one wants to fail, which I think is not realistic. I think if you actually look at any of the most successful photographers in our industry, entrepreneurs in any industry, in any market vertical, you're going to see that the vast majority, 99% of those individuals, had tons of failed ideas that never came to realization, and they learned from them, ultimately leading to their successful ideas, which allowed them to now position themselves in a place where they could, make $300,000 or $400,000 as a photographer a year, or doing X, Y, or Z, or whatever it is.
Sure.
But I think it's a really important thing is to understand that. I hear that a lot, I guess is what I'm saying. I hear that, is this good enough or whatnot? Like, I think at some point you just need to push yourself out there and come back to that, kind of business 101 saying that if you never ask the question, if you never put yourself out there, the answer will always be no. If you sit there and you say, if you don't ask, am I good enough to be hired by Nat Geo? It doesn't matter, because the answer is no, because you never ask the question. You never put yourself out there. Same thing could be hired. Should I be hired to shoot this person's wedding? Should I be hired to do this project for this tourism board? Like, if you're not willing to ask the question, if you're not willing to put yourself out there, then you can't expect to find success in this industry or any other, to be fair.
There's a phrase that really resonated with me that has been kind of just stirring around in my brain lately. And it's something that I'm even trying to internalize myself. And it's the idea that I have failures, but I am not a failure. So, like, you can fail and you can try things and you can continually have things fail, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a failure as long as you're continuing to keep trying something else.
Absolutely. And you're learning from it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that once you relinquish all control and then you're like, all right, I can't do anything, then that's when it gets to the point to where you need to kind of reevaluate. But as long as you're continually out there, like, taking a swing at it, like, you have fails, but you're not a failure. And I think that could be a perfect analogy, especially with something like photography, where, I mean, there's always going to be more shots. There's always going to be more things to take pictures of. So.
Absolutely. And I to be fair, to this day, I will be walking my dog around our neighborhood here in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I will think of some really stupid thing I did or said to a client that I really wish I didn't do. And I'll dwell on it for a second. I'll be like, that was just so bad. And then I'll remember that I learned from it and I never made that mistake again. And so, everyone does that. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone, you'll wish that your pitch, your pitch was better, that you didn't make, this small little mistake on this photo or whatever it is. But as long as you learn from those mistakes, like I said, and like you were just reiterating, you can grow from it, and you'll find success through that process of learning to be a better creative, learning to be a better marketer, learning to be a better photographer, a better human being. I think all comes from learning from, failures. And as you said, that doesn't make us failures. That makes it a learning lesson that we can gain positive action from, and not dwell on the fact that we made a mistake or we said something stupid or did something stupid. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, as long as we do something with it positively.
Agreed, 100%. We have a question from chat here. Was there a specific photograph or photographs in your portfolio that you feel caught National Geographic's attention? And if there was any images, what were they?
Well, early on in my career, I ended up, I guess backtracking really quick. So I left university after I graduated, worked in the hospital, moved to British Columbia. From there, picked up my first camera, and then realized that I wanted to be back on the road traveling. So I had my camera in hand. I bought a one-way ticket to Thailand and ended up spending 3 years living out in Southeast Asia, jumping around from different country to country, just right at the kind of travel, .com boom. So I was doing writing for Sierra Club and Condé Nast and a lot of other little things, just trying to make a little bit of money to get by from month to month. And so most of my portfolio by that time was either British Columbia, which is like my early stuff, which is cringeworthy, but is what it is, at least looking back now. And then a lot of it was stuff from Southeast Asia. So I spent a lot of time in ancient temples and studying Buddhism and Zen and Taoism, and it was a lot of that kind of travel, cultural landscape stuff. And so there's a few images that I certainly have. I don't think I actually sent them to you to display, but of the one that comes to mind is a monk that was walking across the temples of Angkor Wat City, the very top precipice of Angkor Wat City in Cambodia. And it was one of those scenes early on where I was still figuring out my camera, figuring out what settings, figuring out how to take a good image. And I was up there in the right place at the right time, and I saw this I saw this photo happening before my eyes. This monk came out of the corner, and he was it's like this square. The top part of the Angkor Wat City is 4 different squares. It's all based on the Hindu religion and all sorts of other different stuff that I don't need to get into. But anyway, this monk wearing all white, so he was a special monk of some kind, was walking around the corner, and I kind of saw him turn to angle right where the rising sun, so it's like 7 o'clock in the morning, was going to hit. And so it was one of those things where I was fortunate and lucky because I still wasn't 100%, set on understanding, exposure triangle and all this stuff is happening, but I had everything dialed in correctly. And I kind of just waited. It was one of the first times where I just kind of waited for that moment for the monk to cross. And I took a couple images, getting the perfect, stride separation between the legs. And it's this beautiful ancient, 2,000-year-old temple with this beautiful soft sunrise glow. And this monk walking by in this perfect white robe. It was a magical moment. And that was one of my most prolific early on images that was sent as part of a portfolio to them early on. And they were looking for a lot of different stuff. They were looking for, talent in photography, because I was out there leading trips and teaching photography, but also in my travel experience about, logistical planning, because I was planning these trips and putting them together for them. So there was a lot of different elements in there. It wasn't just like, oh, this guy's a great photographer. I think they saw some talent and some skill, and I've certainly learned a lot since then. But it definitely was, it was a bit of a mixture of things, specifically with Nat Geo when it came to that job.
Makes total sense. You said something earlier on that I wanted to kind of come back to, and this is actually a perfect segue. Is, you've traveled extensively around the world. And with that, you are coming into contact with a lot of different cultures.
Sure.
One thing that you said earlier is, a cardinal rule with photography, or a cardinal rule just, in life, is don't be an ass. And so I think that that's like such a very understated sentiment to have. But I wanted to kind of bring that back to the idea of exploring and experiencing new cultures for the first time. How do you kind of move about and go throughout the entire world without having any of these major faux pas? There are a lot of different cultures that have like different customs and different things, and you always want to make sure that you're not doing anything to of course offend people or make a big faux pas. Have you kind of like built up a system that you use, or what are your tips as far as like how to work within cultures that maybe we're not familiar with?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on the location. I think everything always starts at the research level. So I always try to do as much research as I can when I'm going to visit a new country, a new location, going to witness a very specific event, maybe especially, religious ones. And then I try to be as up to date as I can on that type of information. This is, standard Google searches, travel guides, reaching out to my contacts. And that's kind of the next phase, where I have a network of fixers around the world that I have used in different countries. And those fixers know other fixers because it's a small industry. And so oftentimes when I'm going to a new place that has a bit more uncertainty than I'm used to, then I will almost always work with a fixer on the ground. And for those that don't know, a fixer is a guy that will sit there and help you plan logistics, security if it's needed, will usually double as a translator, all sorts of other stuff. Now, I didn't have those connections. I didn't have that knowledge early on in my career. Early on, I kind of just went full in. I would do as much research as I could and, studied rough guides, Lonely Planet books and stuff. But I would spend a lot of those early years far away from tourist areas, and really in the thick of a lot of these different communities. And it was challenging in the sense that I remember Vietnam, for example. Those the first 2 years of doing this back in 2006. I rented a motorcycle and spent 4 months just traveling around Vietnam, looking for stories, documenting whatever I could. And oftentimes that led me to find myself in locations far off the beaten path with no one else that spoke English. My Vietnamese is not very good, especially back then. And just having to navigate that idea of feeling like a fish out of water to feeling out of place, and realized that I love that feeling. I like the challenge. I like finding myself in those situations within reason, of course. Like I said, security and safety is always a focus. But it's that kind of mentality of that draw of that contrasting ways of life, of lives or thought or beliefs, which really spurred me to really want to travel more and to get into photography to begin with. And so I've always been fascinated with, going to these remote places and talking and having conversations with individuals when I have a translator or I speak the language, which isn't all the time. But yeah, it's fun. It's interesting. And coming back to your, not being an ass mantra that I mentioned, I try to be humble. I try to, the hard part of travel photography is that so many travel photographers and tourists are a huge part of this problem, is really dehumanizing to a lot of these cultures and communities that we go through. It's really a sad and unfortunate thing that photographers will go to these countries, stick a camera in someone's face and think that it's their right to take their photo. If the roles were reversed and I was sitting down in, New York City and someone did the same to me, I'd be like, what are you doing? Or especially if they came to my home, like, why would any of us allow that? And so I think I always try to approach that side of things with a bit more humility, not being obtuse. Oftentimes I would have my camera away and I'd go and sit in an area if there were people that I wanted to photograph or a story I wanted to tell, and just kind of hang out for a while. Sometimes I'd start conversations with people, and it was only after I broke some of that ice or invested that time that I would then ask if I could bring out my camera to take images. And that helped me, get closed door access to a lot of different, experiences that I think a lot of other people missed, because they're a bit more full on in terms of walking around and sticking their camera in people's faces and, doing it sadly, the old fashioned way. Yeah. So I think there's an element of that is certainly important in trying to reverse that trend of dehumanizing aspects of photojournalism, of travel photography, of tourism, and that whole space for sure.
Yeah, I think that is a very key and very important point to bring up, especially because I know that others who may be watching this are going to be traveling and things like that. But anytime that I kind of get a chance to talk about this, I think it's really important that the way that you described it, I think is so perfectly summarized. Just, if you were sitting out at home and like someone just walked up to you and like started like, they didn't speak any language that you spoke, and they just started taking pictures of you and then just wandered off into the distance. Yeah. Like, you'd be like,
you'd be calling the cops. Let's be honest.
Yeah. You'd be like, what? Is this guy going to rob me? Like, you don't know what's going on. And the sad reality is that so many people that are I experienced this a little bit when I was in Thailand. Like, so many people are just oftentimes used to it at this point that it's almost a little sad.
Yeah, but, like, become numb to it.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because like it almost reminds me of like the idea of just like photographing animals in a zoo. They're like, okay, yep, we're just like an attraction. Like, yeah, it's commodifying like the people. And I'm
absolutely
I rally really hard against that in the core of me. So I appreciate that is your approach, because I think that is extremely undervalued and it should be championed quite heavily.
Appreciate that.
I wanted to touch on your other project that you have, which is the Giving Lens. Tell us a little bit about what that is and kind of how that came to be.
Sure. So the Giving Lens is an organization that stems to blend this idea or passion of photography and art with supporting individuals in need around the world. The reason that I came up with the whole concept and idea back in 2011 was actually, this is a great springboard, was because of these things that I noticed by traveling for a number of years. By that time, I was 6 or 7 years into my career, and realizing, as we talked about, the dehumanizing nature of travel photography, of the superficial nature of the travel experience that people typically get where they go to a country for a few days and it's just, you're inundated around other tourists, seeing the same things, none of it which is often real. And then the third part was that you never really know where your money's going. So, whether you go to Thailand or Costa Rica or wherever you're going, vast majority of those, tourism-based businesses, and maybe not necessarily the tour companies, but certainly the hotels and whatnot, are actually foreign owned, right? So the money that you have that's going into these places isn't really going to help the communities that you're there to either see or experience or help or whatever it is. And so solving those three main core problems is one of the reasons I came up with this idea of the Giving Lens. And so what we do at the Giving Lens is we take teams of aspiring photographers and sometimes professionals with us, where we have two professionals like myself leading the trip, and we go down to various different countries around the world, from Mexico to Nicaragua, India, Tanzania, Jordan, Fiji, all sorts of places, where we've partnered with local NGOs and communities, where we are there to bring our passion for photography to these communities. And sometimes it's documenting a project. Sometimes that means bringing donated camera gear and helping develop a photography program for an after-school program to keep kids out of, gangs in the barrios in places like Nicaragua, to helping, document what's going on in women's vocational schools. We've done work with the migrant trains coming up from Central and South America, coming into Mexico and trying to seek asylum in the US, all sorts of different elements. And photography is the thread or the conduit that we have these conversations, that we are directly trying to help these organizations and the communities and the people that they are then helping. And each of those trips acts as a fundraiser as well. So we raise, thousands of dollars, sometimes significantly more, and donate those back to the same community. So to come on the trip, it costs money for, typically it's Westerners coming on these trips. And then that money then gets filtered back to the same people, the same individuals that you would be working with on the ground, in the same communities that we've been helping lift up for years, to empower them to have more of a control over their own destiny. And that's another big caveat of kind of what we try to do with the Giving Lens.
I really like that. That's fantastic. Is there like a particular NGO that I know it's hard to pick one, but is there an NGO that you feel like is really out there just doing the best work and that you've really enjoyed working with lately?
It is definitely hard to pick one. I'll probably, the one that we've worked with the longest is the one that I mentioned tangentially in Nicaragua. It's called Empowerment International. It's a phenomenal organization. And what they do, and they already had a program set up, but we've helped build it over the years, where their sole purpose is that they're an advocacy and support group for the education side of the youth. And so they're trying to figure out ways in order to keep kids' retention rates in schools extremely high. So typically what happens in a lot of these developing countries, a lot of these poor countries, is that kids will typically either be pulled out of school from their parents to go work on farms or to make money for the family because they need as much money as they possibly can, or they will get sucked into gangs or violence or other stuff that's happening because it is one of the few avenues that they potentially could get money out of doing various generally illegal things. And so the Empowerment International came in to Nicaragua years ago, and their purpose was to create a program that made incentives for these kids to stay in school and to continue learning, and to create educational spaces for these kids to come after school to get more learning and more education and support through tutors and all sorts of other stuff. But in order to take advantage of some of the extracurricular programs they developed, which such as mountain biking and photography, they had to make sure that they were staying in school. And in doing so, they created a program that has, I think right now it's like a 98% or 96% retention rate, which is insane if you actually think about a lot of other youth education programs somewhere around the world, which oftentimes have 40 or 50 or 60%. And what that means is that through this idea of someone's passion for photography or the fact that they've never owned a bike before to go mountain biking gives them an incentive to stay in school, further their education. And now we've been working with them for 9 years. I am now seeing kids that we originally saw when they were in 10 or 11 or 12, and now they're graduating from high school and they're going to college, and some of them are actually studying photography and are actually making a living doing it. And it's just one of the many kind of success stories that we've had, but Empowerment International has been at the core of that. And they were one of the inception programs that helped me figure out and finalize how I wanted TGL to operate, and then how we can support a great organization like them. So if you're looking for an organization to support, definitely check out Empowerment International. You can do a web search out there. They're amazing group, amazing leaders, amazing kids. And they, of course, need any support that you guys can give.
That's a fantastic organization. Just anything in general, I feel like that can give you an alternate route to finding your own way, especially in some of the more impoverished countries and communities around the world. It doesn't seem like there are opportunities abound, and I think that that's something that often gets completely overlooked, or just kind of pushed to the side of like, oh, well, it's, that's just the way it is. And it's like, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be the way that it is. And, something like mountain biking or photography, like there's a lot that you can do with that for a lot of people with minimal effort. So that's fantastic. I've been reading and researching a lot about what you guys have been doing, and it's really cool to see people, for lack of a better term, putting their money where their mouth is, like wanting to actually get out there and be the change that they want to see. I really appreciate that.
It's been great seeing that interest, because I think that's as you just mentioned, I think it's a common issue, because I think a lot of people have good hearts out there. A lot of people want to do good, but they don't know where to start, right? And that's another piece that we try to solve, that we try to sit there and be a middleman to provide this conduit to make a tangible difference, to see that tangible difference, and to help empower communities. And I think that's, again, just quickly reiterating that, I think that's a really big thing that often is overlooked in the humanitarian world. So many different organizations out there, because there are thousands and thousands of organizations in all sorts of countries, have created more of a cycle of dependence rather than a cycle of uplifting communities. And the dependent cycle is where I come in and I give you something, and then you have to then come back to me in order to get another one, whether it's free shoes or hygiene or whatever it is, right? Rather than an empowering organization empowers those communities to take more control over their future, to create either an industry or a job or opportunities where they then don't have to rely on someone else's help in order to navigate, their own, life choices and what they want to do. And so I think that's key, whether someone out there is thinking about supporting Empowerment International or is just doing your own research because you have a big heart and you want to help. Make sure that whatever organization you guys are looking into has that as part of their focus. They shouldn't be trying to create this cycle of need and supply and demand, because it's not sustainable. Eventually money dries up, right? Eventually sponsors dry up or things change. And that's not a good situation for anyone. So look for organizations that empower individuals. That's the key.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a circumstance of, teach a man to fish versus, giving him a
Exactly.
fish.
Exactly.
And being able to develop an industry, I think, is also huge. We're seeing a massive rise in travel. We're seeing a massive rise in people eloping. I'm relating this back to my world a little bit now, but I mean, there are some very beautiful places all around the world that we might never have seen if it hadn't been for a handful of people that were, blessed by organizations like what Empowerment International is doing, that allowed them the space to actually get out there and feel confident enough. And bringing it way back to your point earlier, like that might just be enough confidence to where they're out there and they make the ask to teach a Nat Geo workshop, and it can have real mountain avalanche effects down the road for a small community that's looking for something like that.
100% agree.
That's awesome. I'm going to dig a little deeper. I want to know, like, what is it that you find fulfillment in photography? I've been asking myself this every year or so. I'll just kind of reiterate and ask myself, what is it about photography that brings me fulfillment? And I wanted to kind of pass the question off to you and see what is it that you do, or what is it about your work that you continue to keep coming and showing up for every day?
It's a great question. I think for me, a lot of it comes down to almost like the storytelling or the capturing of these moments. Like I find that so much of the work that I do these days, which is predominantly, wildlife and conservation efforts, but also just visiting these amazing locations, is, as you were, slightly mentioning before, a lot of these experiences are fleeting, right? Like whether it's the melting ice caps, or glaciers receding, migration patterns changing, species becoming endangered or going extinct. I think it's really imperative for individuals in a space like I'm at, and being fortunate to be where I'm at in my career, to be able to use that position, to be fortunate to have the choice to sit there and try to document as much as I can out there, to go out and track wild jaguars in the in Brazil, because who knows when the next wildfire is going to come out that's going to destroy their habitat, or snow monkeys in Japan, or tribes in Papua New Guinea. I think the world's a really big place, and it's certainly a smaller world than it was 50 years ago. But the vast majority of people on this planet don't really know what it's like in their neighboring state, let alone their neighboring country. And so photography for me is the conduit that allows me to tell a story, that allows me to invoke an emotional reaction and to share those with other people. And that idea of storytelling to me is a very powerful allure when it comes to photography. Not necessarily just directly in that direct way of this photo tells a story, but also in the mindset of the storytelling elements of the physical medium of photography, and how that kind of tells partially a story, and then like the viewer fills in the rest. Like when I give talks about this, I talk about the core elements of a story, right? You have the introduction, you have some sense of setting of the scene, you have some rising tension, and then you have things fall off in a culmination, right? So whether you're reading a book or watching a movie in a movie theater, like that's what you get. With photography, the beautiful thing is that as the creative, I have the ability to compose, to expose, to include in or not include in, to select my subject, to choose atmosphere and lighting and all these other things that are important to me in order to convey something. And then that's kind of where my part of the story of that image stops. And then when I send it out to social media, when I license it out and it's going on a billboard in Times Square, when it's put into a magazine, it's then the viewer's responsibility to fill in the rest of the story. And if my image is captivating enough, hopefully it will stop them as they scroll through their Instagram feed, or they're randomly coming across my website, or they're walking down Times Square and they see the image, and then they fill in that other side of it. I think that to me is a very exciting reality when it comes to photography that a lot of people don't think about, because you think about, like, again, a book or a movie, like the author or the director, like, generally has to like complete most of that sphere of that story within that space. And for us, it's more of a two-part way where the viewer is making those objective choices or decisions, how they emotionally are reacting to something, how my choice of atmosphere or color or composition, as you'd mentioned before, does things differently depending on who's viewing it. And that to me is pretty exciting. And you mix that with that idea of capturing things that may or may not be around for all that much longer, depending on the subject that we're talking about. It gets very addictive, and that's why I keep coming back to it, is because it's a fun way to complete that sphere, to have that relationship with people around the world that I never met, but they saw one of my images and it invoked something within them. And same thing about video work. I'm starting to get more and more into video work, but either way, it's the same kind of principle nature that I think to me is the most exciting thing about what we do as photographers or visual artists, whatever you want to label ourselves as.
I love that. So how is it, because I think that this is another thing that I've kind of seen with a lot of landscape work specifically is I also am very much a person that is about the story. Like as a wedding photographer, like the story is paramount because I'm always trying to recreate and convey the same emotions and same feelings in a story arc. My question for you is how do you convey or how do you evoke that sense of story in such a minimal amount of frames? And then also, how do you convey that in, let's say, something that's been photographed by numerous people throughout time? I mean,
Sure.
if you're looking at, maybe not, I know that you're not necessarily like hitting tourist traps, but like if you're at an iconic location, if you're at Petra or something, like you're not going to not take a picture there. Like how do you evoke a story from something like that?
Sure. So two-part question, or so I'll give you a two-part answer. So I think first and foremost, when it comes to how do I do that within photography in general, I think is coming back to that idea of storytelling. The core elements of a story, I think, correlate directly within an image. You have your protagonist, which is your subject. You have the idea of composition, which is kind of like your plot line. You have your choice of, exposure, how you control light within your image is really the atmosphere, the feeling of the image, which includes, which colors you're overemphasizing or including or removing. Your choice of shutter speed, depending on your subject, whether you're freezing motion in order to freeze someone in time, or you're slowing down, you're using slower shutter speed to allow for the perception of speed or movement. All can play huge roles in terms of how someone reacts to an image that you've created. And those are all those should be cognizant choices that you make out there in the field. I think a lot of photographers tend to overlook the first step when it comes to this, which is kind of that idea of identifying your protagonist. And I give an example of like you're standing at a lake in Patagonia and it's a beautiful sunrise. Why are you taking the photo? Is it because it's pretty? Because to me, that's not enough. That's a snapshot. That's something you can take with your cell phone. Which is great. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not really a photograph. To me, a photograph has more intent, has more behind it. Is it the light reflecting off the water? Is it how the clouds are working around the mountain? Is it the rocks and the water crashing in the foreground? And it's this inception point of the idea of why you are choosing to take a photograph that should start the pathway and the process to help you choose all of the other different variables that come into play. Your choice of exposure, of ISO, of shutter speed, of composition, subject placement, removing distracting elements, like all these core elements, both in the field and then in post-processing. Which colors are you trying to emphasize? Which shadows? Where are you adding contrast? Where is sharpness important? Like all of these choices should originate from that origin, that inception point for your image. And so to me, that's the process that I go for when it comes to creating any image, is, fully identifying what my subject is and why I'm trying to photograph it. Because why I'm trying to photograph a jaguar hunting a capybara in, Brazil in the Pantanal region of the rainforest down there will dictate those other choices that I make between how I compose for it, which lenses I use, how I choose to expose it, how I'm going to process it, what I'm going to do with it. And I think, again, that thing is often overlooked. They're like, oh, it's something that's pretty. Oh, it's something that I want. To me, that's not enough. I think to me, you have to dig deeper, because the ones that you're just like, oh, it's pretty, are generally the images that you never look at again in your catalog. As you've been doing this for as long as I have, you'll have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images that you may or may not ever look back on. It's the ones that are intentional, the ones that have a purpose, the ones that all those pieces kind of came together are the portfolio images, are the ones that define you as an artist and that make a difference in terms of that idea of storytelling. And kind of segueing into your second part of that question, I take a very similar process, but I'll also do a bit of research when I go to a place. I mean, you said it correctly. Like, you're not going to go to Agra in India and not go visit the Taj, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to happen. Like, you're a fool if that's the worldview that you take, that you can't see or experience something because someone else has experienced it. I think that's quite arrogant, to be honest. And instead, I think trying to look to see what has been done, and then once you get there with fresh eyes, to try to see how can you put your own stamp on it? How, oftentimes I will take the same iconic shot just to kind of have it, because there's reasons these shots are iconic. The shot of, sunrise, the mountain over the Virgin River in Zion National Park. Like, everyone has the shot standing on the same bridge. Like, you can't go there and not take that shot because it's beautiful and there's nothing wrong with it. But once you have that iconic shot, once you've kind of checked that box on your to-do list, then you can kind of experiment. You go down to water level. You can kind of go look for different angles. You can kind of go scout the area and try to do something different the following night. And so that's kind of my general approach. Like, take the kind of shots because, again, there's a reason they're iconic, and you can still find unique and creative ways in order to expose or to do different things with it, depending on your style. But then after you've done that, work the scene a bit and try to figure out what is unique, what is different, what is something that other people might not have seen or rarely have seen. And even if someone else has taken that same shot again, it doesn't really matter. If you share that out on social media or a client, there's a good chance those people haven't seen it either. So, there's over 8 billion people on this planet. Just because other people have photographed it doesn't mean it still can't be unique and special to you or to people that you share that with either.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. I really appreciate that because, I mean, I am guilty of being like, it's a tourist trap, I don't want to go, but I'll still go. But I'm not going to lug my whole camera gear and the whole kit and caboodle out there. But it's true. I mean, some of those shots are iconic for a reason because they're iconic.
Yep.
So we're just about at the top of the hour. It's crazy. It doesn't feel like it's been an hour already, but it has. I didn't get to all of my questions, but I did want to have one closing one for you here.
Sure.
If you were to define what you want your legacy to be going forward, so as a photographer, as Colby Brown, the human, whatever it is, what would you want your legacy to be?
Oh, wow. To be honest, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. It's good for you, Ben. I think it's a hard one. I am of the unique mindset, which may or may not be popular or, a mindset that gets me into trouble or not. But like, I believe that we are beyond the time frame of having another Ansel Adams or even another Annie Leibovitz or any of the other amazing photographers out there. Like, there was so few people that were doing it back then, and these were extremely talented individuals that left a lasting legacy within their mark on the industry. So I think for that, in 50 years, I don't think anyone's going to remember me. And I think I'm okay with that. It's just a general mindset that I have. I don't feel, at least from an ego standpoint, that that's something that I care for or need to attain. What I would like to leave is the lasting impression for the people that I came across, the people that interacted with me, the communities that I tried to help through my organizations, the projects that I worked on, through conservation efforts or species preservation projects, things like that. Is that, I was a guy that was humble. I always tried to do my best. I helped out anyone that I could, when I could, and that I left a positive imprint on as many people as possible out there. I myself have been guilty of resentment, of negative feelings of jealousy towards other people in the past in my career, like we all have as human beings. But I try to push that away as much as possible. I try to focus on the positive. I try to separate myself from all of that fluff that doesn't matter, and simply try to leave the people that I interact with, the people that see my images, the people that see the work that I've done, the books that I've written, the tutorials that I've created, the clients that have come on workshops, and they've come away with a positive experience. Because I believe that positivity is contagious. I believe that positivity leads to, paying it forward. I love doing things, donating money, helping people in need, and not running and jumping on social media and talking about it because it seems a little self-fulfilling and focus more so on myself than the act of what I was trying to do. And so I try to lead by that example as best that I can. And I hope is my lasting legacy. I hope that it leaves a positive imprint on those that are out there in the industry, those that are interested in photography, those that want to give back, those that want to make a difference, those that want to, just help people and help your neighbor. And you see someone struggling in line to pay for milk, like help out and do it. And don't post about it on social media. Like go just be a good human being. I think we need more of that. And that's what I try to focus on. The rest of the stuff, the building the business to do bigger things, to make more money, all that stuff. Like, yeah, of course, I have those goals to help provide for my family and, financial stability and all that stuff. Absolutely. I'm not a nihilist, but I think it's important to focus, like I said, on that positive mindset. And that's the reason why I respond to every email that comes to my way. I have clients that text me that I took a workshop with me 10 years ago and I still help them out. That's why I try to be that individual to turn someone's day around as often as I possibly can, because it helps feed my own energy. It helps feed my own passion to want to be better, to want to be a better human, to want to be a better creative, want to be a better photographer. And like I said, to hopefully leave a little more positivity left in the world.
Wow. Yeah. What a perfect note to end on. And I can attest to that, you guys, because this show right here, this is not a whole big giant production or anything. And Colby, you took the time to join us today. And it just goes to show that you're practicing what you preach. So I appreciate that. You guys, I think we're going to close it out from here. Colby, I appreciate you taking the time again. I know, sorry, we went a couple minutes over, but I appreciate you hanging in there with us.
Absolutely.
I'm super excited to, I'm just super excited you guys are here and you got to hang out with us for this conversation. That was fantastic. Colby, thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks for everyone that's watching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, you guys. We will see you next time. I can't wait. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks, Colby.
Cheers.